Joined now by LaTosha Brown, co-founder of Black Voters Matter. LaTosha, it's great to see you.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
What have you been doing in Georgia leading up to today?
Oh, we have been working. We have been doing a number of things. Matter of fact, I just got off the bus a few minutes ago and going back to a polling site. We have been doing, it's really important that people really recognize what is happening this election cycle. There have been some changes since the last election in 2021, the first runoff election and this runoff. The changes resulted from the SB 202 bill. And so what you saw is we had 8 weeks prior, for early vote, to be able to vote for the runoff election. That has been truncated to only 4 weeks. And so there have been some changes that we want to make sure that people know. So we've been out in the streets, we've been canvassing, we've been caravanning, we've made millions of calls, and we've been doing everything we can to reach voters to let them know how critical this election is and some of the changes resulting from that SB 202 bill.
LaTosha, you and I talked when those changes were made, and you were pretty convinced they were intended to suppress the vote, but at least based on the early voting, they're record numbers. How do you explain that?
I think that we are seeing early vote because we've actually put the record numbers in early vote because there's been an enormous amount of ongoing work to actually happen, right, to literally be able to increase that vote. But I do want you to recognize that there has been some impact, right, that SB 202 bill has had impact. In 2021, there were 1.2 million people who participated in mail-in ballot voting. And this year, in the midterms, there were only 0.2 million. That means 1 million people who had access mail-in early voting previously did not this time. That what you recognize that even as I'm going around for mail-in boxes, it's almost impossible to find a mail-in voting box. And so while I think we're looking at kind of this record-breaking, some of it is literally skewed in many ways because you had it over a period of time. You had a longer period of time. Now that time has been truncated. And so you have an intensified, shorter period for people to participate and vote.
This show is going to air exactly at the time the polls close. I hate when people, when the polls have closed, say to someone like you, who do you think is going to win? But having said that, who do you think is going to win, LaTosha?
I actually think Warnock has it. I think for a variety of reasons. One, I think that there is a backlash in the state. I think what has driven the voting turnout has been there's a backlash in the state, not only to the voter suppression laws, but also there is a certain Walker's campaign has actually been insulting, particularly to African-American voters. I think that there's a backlash related to that there's a cherry pick, that Trump would cherry pick a candidate from Texas, bring him to Georgia, right, to run for an office, have no substance, not speak to any of the issues. I think we're going to see that as well. And I think, three, that people know that this is a critical election and that the power balance actually lies on Georgia. So all of those things, I actually think that they work in favor of Senator Warnock.
One last question about this. I try to be respectful of all voters, but I think it's fair to say there is no less qualified candidate for federal office than Herschel Walker. Forget even vampires and werewolves. Almost no qualifications. Even if he loses, he's going to get 47 or 48% of the vote in Georgia. How do you explain that?
I think we have to recognize this has been about raw power, that the Republicans have decided that part of their strategy was two things. That one, they just need to get a black face of someone who was an athlete or had fame, put them in position, and also plant this narrative that there was going to be black men were upset, and that some way those two things were actually going to lead to black voters literally shifting off black voters to go vote on the Republican ticket. And we've not seen that because we're far more sophisticated voters than they actually anticipate us. And so I think that what we're seeing, I think it's extremely disconcerting, but it's also very harmful that we have this man who, one, does not have any substance. Secondly, when you hear him talk, in many ways, he's incoherent. He's not even interested in talking about the issues at hand. And third, he has not done anything in a space of leadership that has had any substantive impact other than run a football.
Okay, let's turn from the midterms to the 2024 primary election, when New Hampshire's longstanding first-in-the-nation tradition may be a thing of the past. On President Biden's recommendation, a panel just voted to move back the Granite State's 2024 Democratic primary election, along with the Iowa caucus, which will be gone, to give South Carolina the first bite at the presidential apple. The new primary schedule will also move up Georgia's Democratic primary and others, but not all Democrats are on board. That includes former state senator from New Hampshire, Jim Splain, who joins Black Voters Matter co-founder LaTosha Brown again to discuss. Jim, welcome. LaTosha, I'm glad you stuck around. Jim, if I can start with you, why is it important, other than pride of ownership, that New Hampshire stay as number one?
Well, it isn't about us. It is not about us. It's what I call the New Hampshire having the benefit of smallness. The benefit of smallness. We are a small state, geographically much smaller than South Carolina or Michigan or Nevada, Georgia, where other states, where candidates will be going to other states. So candidates can get around and spend more time talking with people instead of hiding behind podiums and looking at voters above the podium or sitting behind cameras at television studios. And that kind of face-to-face, eye-to-eye, one-to-one contact is so important, I think.
But can it lead to an outcome that isn't representative of what the candidate is? That's not how a candidate campaigns, Joe Biden being a good example, in the vast expanses of America. They can't go one-to-one elsewhere. So doesn't it give one a false sense?
No, I don't think it does. This is a big country. New Hampshire is not the only primary state. We don't want all the candidates' time. In fact, in recent years, we've seen candidates spend much time in other states and eventually coming to New Hampshire, spending time until our election day, and then going very quickly to other states. We just want them for a little while.
LaTosha, are you supportive of South Carolina being first?
Absolutely.
Why?
You know, I understand the sentiment of what Jim is raising. I think that there's a strong argument about having a small state. But I also think that there is an acknowledgement that particularly in southern states, you know, what we've seen is the overlooking of states that literally have demographics that are actually more even reflective of what we see in the nation. I think what you'll see early on, I think that if South Carolina becomes the first state in the primary, it will bring some of the issues around race, some of the issues around class, some of the issues around some of the economic structural issues that we see in the Deep South. I think that what you'll see is that we'll give the opportunity to bring those up early so that the political candidates, the presidential candidates will have to address to it. I think it's aligns in the same model as what New Hampshire started in 1975. I think as we're seeing the shifts and the demographics and where we are in 2022, I think South Carolina is certainly a state that I would support being first in the primary.
But LaTosha, staying with you for a second, I think it's fair to say there probably wouldn't have been a President Carter, a President Obama, had there not been Iowa. If Bill Clinton hadn't been able to wake up after he came in second, the comeback kid in New Hampshire behind Paul Tsongas, it's very likely there wouldn't have been a President Clinton either without New Hampshire. Does that concern you or no?
You know, it's absolutely a concern. I agree with that. I think that there's an argument that can be made in both ways. I just think that what we're looking at now is that we have to make sure that when we're going forward, it's more reflective of really the demographics of the country. I think early on, it will change. I think it will change the presidential discussion with the presidential nominees and the candidates very differently when they have to battle for a state like South Carolina versus when they have to battle for a state in a New England state. And so I think that changes the dynamics of the conversation. I think it changes the dynamics early on around the positions of those presidential candidates. And I think that's more reflective of the growth and the demographics changes that are happening throughout the nation. You
know, Jim, speaking of demographics, I mean, the facts are the facts. New Hampshire is roughly 2% African-American. Its largest city is Manchester, with I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 120,000 residents. That's not typical of what is the core of the Democratic Party in America. People of color make up a huge part of the infrastructure, and urban areas are also a big part. How does New Hampshire deal with that?
Well, I agree with what LaTosha just said. I watched the entire discussion of the Democratic National Committee Rules Committee, and I heard the representative to the committee from South Carolina make a very impassioned speech as to why we should be recognizing South Carolina as a leader. I think we can have a little bit of all. And by starting in New Hampshire, as traditionally we've done for 100 years, by mandate since 1975, we have seen people be able to run for president without spending the kind of megabucks that they have to spend in other states. You know, New Hampshire is 1.4 million population according to 22 census. South Carolina is 3 times that. Then it's Nevada, and that's twice our size plus in population, plus a vast geographic area. Michigan after that, and Georgia, 10 million each. I mean, that's a lot of people to have to communicate with. You have to spend a lot of money. So we stand a chance in New Hampshire of allowing candidates to talk with us instead of at it to us.
You know, LaTosha, that's a pretty good point. Doing it on the cheap, which a lot of outsider candidates can't do if they got to go to major jurisdictions right at the top of the heap. Is that not a concern?
No, I mean, I understand the argument. I would just say we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry. Regardless of what we would like to say or to think, there are billions of dollars that presidential candidates raise and are going to spend on elections. And I think what is really important is literally, are we shaping the conversation early on in the campaigns, the candidacies, and the campaigns that we really are talking about those things that we need to talk about that's more reflective of this America that we're dealing with, where we have a younger America and a more diverse America. And yes, I think that's a really valid argument around, yet I think in terms of cost, but also when you look at the kind of investment in southern states, that I think it could make southern states more competitive. I think having South Carolina early on would actually make it a more competitive state for the Democratic Party, not just in terms of the primary. I think that it can also help in terms of, as we're talking about resources, to actually set infrastructure and more investment in the political infrastructure of that state.
Jim, we have very little time, but many people think the other reason for this, other than the shift being more representative of the demographics in the party, is it's the best path to re-election for Joe Biden. I'm assuming you want a Democrat elected president in 2024. If Biden and his people have decided, as painful as it is for you New Hampshireites, that this is the best path to re-election, isn't that the one that should be embraced?
Well, you know, I love Joe Biden. I first met him when he was campaigning in New Hampshire, I think back in 1987 at a small party that we had. But he's not always right. And I think on this one, he doesn't quite get it. I get it that New Hampshire might not have the kind of diversity of population that other parts of the country has. But that smallness, that benefit of smallness is important.
Okay, before we go, LaTosha, does Joe Biden get what Joe Biden wants at the end of the day? Is this going to happen?
We'll see. We'll see. I wish I could call it, but I can't.
That's what you said about the Georgia election tonight, too. I think you know more than you're letting on.
I'm calling the Georgia election.
Oh, you did?
Jim, I am calling we have worked too long, too hard for the next 6 years to be stuck with a candidate that is really not interested in serving, only interested in werewolves and vampires. No. The people of Georgia.
And on that, I agree.
On that, you agree. LaTosha Brown, Jim Splain, thanks so much for your time. Good to talk to you both.
Thank you.